the beginning of this semester, I suggested that talking about sex and sexuality is incredibly personal for many people, but it's also political and intrinsically social. Throughout the last 15 weeks, we've looked at the ways in which sexual behaviors, sexual identities, and sexual inequality shapes and is shaped by our society. We've taken a social constructionist approach, which means that we've looked at the ways in which social institutions and social interactions help us understand sex and sexuality in our society, as well as how to interact in society as sexual actors. Taking a social constructionist approach does not mean that we don't have agency. And in this module, we'll look at the ways in which people have organized to fight sexual inequalities by looking specifically at collective action and social movements. We know that as far back as we have historical records, people have spoken out against inequality and injustice. And frequently, people have banded together in collective efforts to create social change and to pressure authorities to respond to discrimination and injustice. But you might be surprised to know that the social movement that we think of today is a relatively recent means of organizing for social change. According to Taro, a social movement is collective challenges based on common purpose and social solidarities in sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities. If we break that definition down a little bit, it becomes easier to understand. When we say a social movement is collective challenges, that means that it is consisted of multiple campaigns, or at least multiple episodes of collective action. When we say that it's based on common purpose and social solidarity, that means that campaigns consist of interaction amongst movement actors, their targets, the public, and other relevant actors. And finally, in stating that a social movement must be in sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities, that means that the target of a social movement is usually those in a position of power. This is often governments or authorities, but it can also be businesses or even religious leaders. Social movements should not be confused with an episode of collective behavior, which is a spontaneous, short-lived action of a large group of people. This could be a riot or an informal gathering after an announcement of a policy or an incident. However, in some cases, multiple episodes of collective behavior can start the foundation of a social movement. While there are many types of social movements, movements related to sexuality rights are often grassroots movements, meaning they emerge from the masses and actions of ordinary individuals instead of being organized by elites. While grassroots movements can provide space for charismatic leaders and organizers to emerge, they're never founded by an individual in a position of power. The history of fighting sexual inequality and sexual hierarchies in our society is a history of social movements and collective action. In this module, we'll be looking at the gay liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s, the ACT UP movement of the 80s and 90s, as well as the current LGBTQIA movement, the trans movement, and the Me Too movement. As we look at these different historical movements, we'll see the ways in which sexual social movements have progressed and even circled throughout history.